In metaphysics, my philosophy, objectivism, holds that there is only one reality, not two, nor four, nor 10.
Hello and welcome to Reality. My name is William, and in a few minutes, Lev will be joining me for the dialogue segment. Our topic is China and the freedom fighters in Hong Kong. This is a huge international news story, so if you're unfamiliar with it, we can provide a link or two in the description of this video for you to catch up. Our focus is going to be on some of the controversies and moral questions regarding businesses that trade with China. One of these businesses is the NBA. You may have heard that the Houston Rockets GM Daryl Morey recently issued a social media post in support of Hong Kong, and this caused China to retaliate by removing Houston Rockets products from store shelves and by dropping sponsorships, which has cost the NBA a lot of money. In addition to all that, LeBron James criticized Morey for the timing of his post, since the Lakers were about to travel to China at the time. Now, people have criticized the NBA for not supporting Hong Kong and for their involvement in China, and basically for pursuing profits over freedom. Another example is the company Blizzard. They make video games like Diablo and World of Warcraft. They also sponsor tournaments. In one of these tournaments, the winner came out in support of Hong Kong during a post-match interview. Apparently this was against Blizzard's rules, and so they took away his prize money and suspended him from competition. This upset a lot of people who support Hong Kong, and so now people are boycotting Blizzard. So that's the real world context that we're dealing with. We want to ask a moral question, get at the moral heart of it, and we want to know, how should we deal with these companies that do business with China? There's a lot to consider here. At one level, there's the personal value you get from the products that these companies offer. You may enjoy watching NBA games and supporting your team by wearing jerseys. You might enjoy Blizzard games and entering the tournaments. So on one hand, you don't want to give up a great value, even if it's just an entertainment value. You don't want to give that up for a lesser value. So you have to decide if what the value you get out of that company is more important than the value you would get by boycotting their involvement with China. However, I think there's another thing to keep in mind, and that's the fact that these companies, in order to do business in China, they need to partner up with a Chinese company. That's the rule in China. So you are, in essence, giving money to China when you do business with the NBA and Blizzard, because these companies are partly owned by Chinese companies. So this, to an objectivist, should remind you of the question of sanctioning evil. Basically, we're asking, is doing business with these companies sanctioning evil? And you don't want to sanction evil because associating or contributing to evil is not in your self-interest, or at least it shouldn't be. So that's the heart of the moral question I want to get to. I think it boils down to the question of, is Blizzard and NBA, are they evil because they are partly owned by a Chinese company and they do business in China? And if they are evil, then at, at what point is our trading with them considered sanctioning evil?
Hi everyone, this is Lev speaking now, and I'm talking with William now. I wanted to add really briefly some of my own thoughts here that when we're talking about boycotting different companies, it's important to keep in mind there's so many ways to boycott a company, so many types of companies. But here we're focusing on more entertainment related companies, whether that's video games or sports, things like that, rather than say uh, companies that make food that you like, or they make say investment products, or say at higher level like military stuff. We're speaking strictly of like consumer items and entertainment. So we want to focus on the NBA on the one hand and Activision Blizzard as the other context here. Um, have you had any newer ideas, William, about say the NBA and boycotting them?
Sure. So I've tried to think of like what the general issue is here, and I think it boils down to whether or not a company is partly owned, or does business in China, and uh, and also the fact that China is basically a force for communism. And if you're against communism, you don't want to sanction that by trading with them. So the problem exists where we have this huge trading partner at a national level who's basically our economic enemy, and our country's flooded with their products. So we're so dependent on a lot of their products that it's hard to boycott the country as a whole. So
Well, I don't know if it would make sense to boycott just an entire country because not all companies in China are necessarily created the same. Although you could say that most of them are have total communist control, so that's the other consideration you could have. Um,
yeah, well, a company that is based in China or is considered a Chinese company, I think they directly contribute to the communist system. So they're part of the enemy. Now it's different with a U.S. company that's partnering with a Chinese company. I'm not sure. I think I said this in my intro that China requires U.S. companies to partner with a Chinese company in order to do business in that country. So that's an additional level of the problem, is there's so many U.S. companies that are partly owned by China, by Chinese companies. Just
well,
for, just to name four, for example, is Glue Mobile, Snap, Activision, Blizzard, and Tesla. They're all major businesses that are partly owned by Chinese companies.
mhm.
Not to mention the huge companies like Microsoft and Apple and all of them.
Well then, well, focusing on the entertainment companies, how would you respond to that with the NBA? I mean,
Yeah, so
how would you decide if you even want to watch their games anymore or to even be aware of it? Like, to what extent should you just cut it out of your life?
yeah, I think that it's a hard personal question, obviously, because these values are your values, and you need to decide if it's worth giving them up in order to fight communism. And
Well, I don't even know if fight communism is the right way to to put it or even think about it. It's not that it's the communism per se that's itself the threat, as much as if they're taking actions that are a threat to you. If the Chinese government is doing anything that is threatening to you, it's one thing to say that they're there and you don't like them, but it's another if they interfere with you directly. If they weren't interfering in any way, I'm not sure I would really care. But if they interfere in terms of Hong Kong and the way the world functions, and I think that's where it matters. Because we're not talking about just, oh, they're sending some um, just some movies over or exchanging some video games. It's deeper than that, I would think.
Well, they're interfering with me indirectly. They're interfering with the NBA directly. So they're forcing the NBA to partner with a Chinese company and then deal with that Chinese company and deal with the communistic economy. So, but that's
Right.
a choice of the that's a choice of the NBA. So it's not like the NBA is blameless.
Of course not.
But for me individually, I think I need to decide if that indirect involvement is something I can put up with or tolerate. Um, because as a intellectual type of person who sees things in a very fundamental philosophical way, I see the economic battle between capitalism and communism, and it's hard for me to side with any element of communism, even if it's indirectly.
Well, I mean, I understand the ideological conflict. I was more pointing out that the conflict that counts is the one that actually affects you in a concrete way. Of course, the abstractions matter, but well, the abstractions matter, but only if those abstractions can be connected to a specific concrete action. I wouldn't want to condemn a company just from dealing as if they were an individual, because companies consist of many individuals and many departments and aspects of it. We wouldn't want to condemn, say, in a video game design company like Blizzard. You wouldn't want to condemn all the designers for the decisions made by the, say, the CEO of the company. They're distinct people, and I mean, on the one hand, yes, you are supporting a company that is indirectly supporting China, but on the other hand, how you can't just say that interacting with China is the problem, because there's so many other people in the company.
But you could say that about any evil nation or evil corporation.
Of
There's
course.
so you have to deal with these corporations and these nations as corporations and nations, not as parts. They're a system, and you're dealing with the system. So, and that's kind of how I see it. I see it as a sanctioning of that evil corporation or evil system. And of course, they're not completely evil. These are mixed bags here we're talking about. So you kind of have to evaluate each one on an individual basis, each corporation or each nation on an individual basis and
Well,
determine
how can
is
you
that
judge them though? Well, how can you judge a company, and as far as not wanting to deal with them, why would you want to ignore the fact that there's a distinct way in functioning of that whole corporation? I mean, we couldn't, just like a nation, you don't have to condemn all of it. You can condemn certain aspects, and based on the way it's run and controlled, in the same way, like you couldn't blame the EPA in the same way you could blame the president of the United States for something. And I mean, of course, you could evaluate the country as a whole, but when deciding what particular action to take, you should keep into account who are you affecting, who are you impacting. Why would you want to impact somebody who's working on the parts of the product you like? Why would you want to negatively impact that? You would want to help what you value and prevent helping anything that you disvalue. Like for example, with Activision Blizzard, I like some Blizzard products still. I like them. I play them. I like World of Warcraft sometimes. I like Diablo 4 that will be coming out. I mean, really appeals to me, and I find those of value, and those aren't the people working on those things aren't the ones in charge or connected to the CEO. They might. I wouldn't want to just say, oh, I have to condemn Blizzard completely. I had to never buy their products. It doesn't seem proportional to me.
Well, how do you know what their views are?
Well, you don't at all. I mean, they could have views I like or could have views I don't like, but they are doing something I care about.
I think what you're saying is you like the product. It's not so much about their political views. About the Lakers, they're my team in Los Angeles, and so I would either buy their products or sponsor them or watch their shows on TV, and I have to decide on the local level if I want to support the Lakers. So that's my issue. On a larger level, NBA, I don't care that much because I don't care about the other teams. So that's kind of like where you like the certain Blizzard products, but you don't really care so much about all the other aspects of the company.
Well, I mean, I care, but it's not that you have to take your actions in a calculated way. It's not that I don't care about the company as a whole and only about the individuals within the company. It's that I can value the individuals within that company and at the same time condemn the actions of the um, people in charge of the company at a management level, at that upper level. I can condemn them and their actions, but I'm skeptical that boycotting a very large company has any impact in any sense because of all this division of labor across a huge company.
Yeah. Well, another idea I've been toying with is the idea of selectively boycotting a company. So like this might apply to your situation with Blizzard, where maybe you don't um, want to boycott the whole company because you get value out of some of their products. So then then you can voice your disapproval. Like you can still use their products, but say, "Look, I like your products, but I don't like what you're doing in China. I wish you would get out of China."
Mm-hmm.
And you could write letters to the editor or whatever, or just write letters to the president of Blizzard to that effect. That might be your type of selective boycott. You don't have to do a universal boycott.
Right. I mean, that would make more sense to me in the very large companies we have now. Boycotting makes sense for small companies because you can have the direct impact and you know who's doing what and the effects of one individual are more closely connected to the decision maker up top. It's not like, say, McDonald's that an employee at your local McDonald's has any really bearing on the values of McDonald's CEO or and vice versa. They're so detached from each other that you can't just take it as a uniform action against the company because there's numerous individuals here, and you don't want to affect them uniformly. I mean, I personally wouldn't want to harm somebody that's not doing something harmful. It doesn't matter how large the company they're in. I don't want to harm them.
I'm concerned that this is kind of like the argument for never going to war with a country, who is evil. If a country uh, is, let's say, sponsoring terrorist cells or terrorist movements within that nation, and then those terrorist cells leave the nation and start attacking your country, well, then your country, we have to decide if we're going to just like selectively seek out the individual terrorists or go after the government that's sponsoring those cells.
Well, you
So
answered it right there. You go after the government. I
Yeah,
mean,
so in the
because the
analogy, you
government's,
would have to go after the corporation.
well, I mean, it depends in what way the corporation's connected to the individual making those decisions. It's like commanding it or something like that. And I mean, that's also different because, I mean, the scale of it is still greater than a corporation, even that you're dealing with a, well, usually a government operate in a way that people who work there pledge allegiance in some direct way to the government in that regime. So anyone you would get caught into that mess is to blame because they willfully proclaimed they took an oath to it generally. I mean, that's what governments do. You take an oath to it, and so you can hold people accountable in a different way. I mean, I guess it would depend. Do they have similar things in a corporation? Are they as uniform as a government? I I don't think Blizzard is as uniform as that, so I don't think that's really applicable. They're not that um, ubiquitous. They're more distributed.
Well, it's only applicable in the proper context. You mean the context is the relationship of a collective entity to the entities that make up the collective. That's the context here. So I'm saying that the Blizzard is to its employees as like Iran is to Iranian citizens.
I don't see the similarity because I mean they're completely different entities with going. I mean, it's not just a collection of people. This is even more particular than like a population under the control of Iran. This is just the people who produce a distinct product. They're not. I mean, you're explaining that it's more seamless than I'm saying. It's not seamless. There's so much division to have. It, it's not that you can't group certain things together, but it's how you put it into your calculus. How do you determine the right action? You do it by even considering the people you would impact. If you go to war with a country, you would still want to consider the impact you have depending on your actions. If you have to evaluate, is this the only action that can be taken? Are there other actions that can be taken without as much an effect to my values? And that's more what I'm going for. I want to condemn the decision makers at Blizzard, but I also want to acknowledge and support the things I care about. And that's really
So,
what it comes down to for me.
well, sticking with my analogy, um, when you go to war with a country, ideally you don't simultaneously support them, right? You don't say, I'm going to start crushing your armies and then I'm going to give you money to rebuild more armies.
Well, yeah, there's no value in that. It's a much easier decision as far as attacking a government. It's not as hard. It's much easier.
So if you want to get Activision, Blizzard Activision out of China, you don't say, I'm going to buy your products and give you money to stay in China, but you should get out of China.
Well, you're giving money to people that are using it for other purposes. I can tell you the game designers aren't using it for that end, and that's the difference. It's not an exchange of value with China, and I guess it depends then, like how Blizzard pays its employees. And I know within the gaming industries, companies often underpay their employees and abuse them for that. So, I mean, that could be another reason you could say, oh, I don't want to partake in that because I know Blizzard isn't going to be fairly paying them. I know Blizzard isn't actually taking into account the value its designers produce.
A Chinese company actually owns part of Blizzard. So you are literally giving money to China.
Well, only if I lived in China giving them money for that product.
No,
It's not like
you're
I'm.
giving money to the company, which is owned by a Chinese company.
Well, no, and Blizzard is a U.S. company. It's not. I mean, to operate in China, they have to have some partnership with China, but it's
Yeah,
not
so
as though it's.
5% goes to uh, Tencent, which is a Chinese company that owns part of Activision. That's what I'm saying at the root of it. I'm not saying that this justifies boycotting them completely. I'm just saying this is the fact. You are giving money to Tencent.
Yeah, at some level. I mean, of course, I'm giving them money to some extent because there is some partnership and the whole company is involved, and of course, you could have to expect that money in one area will go to another at some point. But I'm
Yeah,
more
so
concerned
five
about.
five cents 5 cents out of every dollar goes to Tencent. 95 cents goes to Blizzard Activision. So that might be your calculus. You know,
Yeah.
if a company is 51% owned by the Chinese company, then I won't do business with it.
Well, yeah. I mean, it wouldn't even be. I mean, that would make sense to me. I mean, it depends on the scale. I think most often, like Blizzard
So like,
is
is
very
there is
large
there a
scale.
percentage? Is there a percentage you would, is it just product based, or
No,
the fact that not everyone in the company is evil, or is there a percentage ownership you wouldn't be able to tolerate?
I think mostly it's considering all those things at once. None of those equal. I can't take each one individually and say, oh, that's enough. It's more like case by case, and also even the uh, news context, the current news happenings. How involved would that be? Say, I mean, I care more about what China does now with the conflict with Hong Kong. I care more about the issues about it. So, I mean, this puts my threshold of acceptability much lower than it would be otherwise. Because I'm observing the way China is getting more um, strict and more totalitarian. And it lowers my threshold of acceptability of how another company would go into that. I mean, I would condemn a company, say, for supporting a country like, trying to think of a good example. Maybe supporting Russia indirectly, but it's not. I don't have the same level of concern as I do with China or Iran. I mean, so it also depends on the scale of the wrongdoing of who you're dealing with.
Sure.
I know that's not as straightforward as you might want, but when we're trying to evaluate our values and consider them, it shouldn't be easy. And there's a lot to consider, especially in this day and age. It's sometimes almost overwhelming, but you do what you can.
Well, I think that it's important to still act on principles.
Of
So we got
course.
to figure out the principle here. I think the main objectivist principle is that uh, we shouldn't sanction evil, and if we evil can only exist by our blessing if we give it support, sanction. So it's kind of up to us, the good people, to do something to make it go away.
Right. That's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, it's even more important. Don't sanction evil. It's support the values that are in your self-interest. That's really the bigger concern. That's the deeper principle of you don't sanction evil because I mean, the reason you don't sanction evil is because you don't want to harm your values. And you wouldn't want to fight against evil by harming your values. That would be self-sacrificial and you wouldn't even really be fighting. You would be losing the battle if you're harming your values. You don't want to fight somebody by turning around and just beating up what you care about. They would have already won if you did that.
Well, I assume by value you're talking about the good people in the organization
Yes,
or
or
the
that could
product.
include both. I mean, the good people make the products. You can't separate them. The
So
good
it's the
products are
product.
the people.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of good people in these companies, but it's a question of sacrificing um, at some level, it's a question of supporting them um, while and looking the other way regarding the whoever's evil at that company who's gotten them involved in China.
I mean, of course you have that concern. You want. Well, I don't think that really changes what I said because you still have to. I mean, it would be kind of lazy to me if somebody just said, "I'm boycotting the entire company just because the higher ups made decisions I don't like." Like, what do you say about the values you abandoned? You have to say abandoning those values was in fact productive. That you didn't just try to harm the person that's directly harming you, but you're not letting the things you care about get harmed either. And if what I care about gets harmed when I pull back my support for the company in its entirety, then I would just be harming myself, I think. I'd just be running away from the problem rather than just trying to get involved and acknowledge that there's something more to fight for when I try to support the people I care about within the company. I mean, it is more difficult to fight the powers that you don't like, but while also supporting the people within that company. Although I guess you could wonder, at least, is there an alternative thing you can do? Would you form an alternative company and attract all those people? I don't think it'd be that out of the question to just form a new company and attract all the employees there. I mean, that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. You might have to get more creative than the usual, oh, I'm just taking away my money. You want to do something with it, an alternative. I mean,
My focus is on the more longer term view. Um, I think that when you focus on how your actions are going to affect these individual people at the companies, that's a shorter term. I'm looking at the longer term fight between capitalism and communism. If we continue down the road of like putting up with these Chinese policies, trade policies, and letting American companies, just continue to be overtaken by them, then what's going to happen in the long run is that China is going to own these companies and they're going to come to America and we won't have capitalism anymore.
if you want something to be done in the long run, I don't think any of these economic decisions are where it matters. They can only make a short-term impact, and I think that's the case with all economic uh, reactions. They're all short-term. If you want something long-term, it has to be military. That's the only way to make a long-term change with an interaction with a company or an interaction with the country that's directly in opposition to your values.
Well, I think that these companies can pull out of China.
Well, sure, but then uh, if you want a long-term change, then you enact laws, say embargo against China or a naval blockade of China around Hong Kong and things like that. You need forceful action to have these long-term consequences. You have to think of China as an enemy country, and if you think of it that way, you need far more than any economic action. You need force with it.
I think that ultimately it doesn't really matter how many people China has, and um, because if as long they can't really do anything militarily unless they steal that technology from us or from other nations that create it. So even if they have 1.3 billion people, we don't need to go to war with them. We just need to pull out and let them starve.
Well, that doesn't seem appropriate either, because let them starve is like kind of what I've been arguing against. You don't fight against a country by turning your back against the things that you value within that country. There are individuals within that country who have done absolutely nothing wrong, and you would want to support them. If you let them starve, it's like, what was the point of it all? They all died anyway. Who cares?
It's the point of what? The point is to preserve your way of life. It's not
Yeah,
not
but
to
you wouldn't
give
be
it.
preserving any way of life if the things that are valuable have perished.
They're not value. Communists aren't valuable to me.
I was talking about the people in China. That's you said. What do you mean? Do you mean the communist people in China, or do you mean the
The
people of
people who
China?
support a communist regime.
But that I don't see what that has to do with what we're
I
talking
mean, what
about.
you
I mean, you
could make
said
that
let them
argument about
starve. You
every.
said,
We shouldn't. Well, then we shouldn't boycott or embargo any evil thing.
but who starve? You said if you mean the communists, well then you can't just have a universal thing. You have to be targeted in some way so that you would prefer to affect just the communists or the ones who explicitly support the Chinese government and explicitly support it, rather than say people just living there who are against it or even try not to say anything because they're afraid they're going to be killed. Things
Well,
like
then you
that.
start a campaign to rescue the people who want to leave.
Right.
I
So
I don't mean
that
just
makes
like
sense.
just sit back and watch them all starve. I mean
Okay.
just don't help them. If
That
if
makes
the
sense.
if the communists are trying to take over your businesses, don't go in there and let them. I mean, sit along the border and collect anyone who escapes.
I mean, I guess that's a better answer than I like. I mean, I prefer that answer for me then, because
I mean,
in a
isn't
way
that what?
you're. Well, yeah, I think it's the idea is that I'm trying to promote like even more radical action. Like, oh, yeah, you can boycott a company. Well, we have to think sometimes what's something else we can do. You don't want to just think of all the traditional ways of supporting something. I mean, like you're saying, we could wait at the border and rescue everyone in from China. Well, that's more radical than what people may usually say. Oh, we're just going to nuke them and that's it. Like you're saying, we should just nuke Iran and that's it. Like, well, we should consider those other things, and I think that makes you consider radical action, and that brings us into a better place than we were before.
Well, with China, I don't think nuking them is an option
Well,
because
I agree. I just went for the extreme. I guess the overall point I'm making is that we just have to consider the actions we want to take, and let's not put it into like a compartmentalized thing. Like either you boycott or do nothing. I mean, those aren't the only options. You have to think about more, and other options actually might take more work out of you, and that's what you would want actually. Like you're supposed to fight for your values, not just. It's easy to boycott, but it's hard to take some action towards something. Like you were saying letter to an editor. I mean, maybe that's not the appropriate action in this case, but you would want to do things like either support like nonprofit organizations, or maybe if you had enough money, you can just literally drive a boat to China and then ask people to come with you or something. Like that could be something you do, or like who knows? It really depends on your resources and um, the damage the other country's causing.
yeah, I think at some level, we shouldn't expect fighting for our values to be easy, though, or like bloodless. I
Right.
think I think that you're going to have to make very hard decisions, like boycotting companies you value their products, in order to fight for your higher values. You know, there's a hierarchy of values, and if you start fudging and not supporting your primary values, then your integrity, as an intellectual or as a moral person, will break down.
Integrity. I was thinking South Park. Integrity Farms.
I'm not familiar with that. Can you explain what you mean by integrity farms?
Well, Integrity Farms is a reference to South Park in the most recent season. The character Randy Marsh starts a pot farm in Colorado, I believe, and he calls it Integrity Farms because he's saying like, oh, we have integrity of the U.S. values, and they have this joke commercial with like the founding fathers, and they all have integrity, and they're growing hemp for pot, which I mean that's pretty funny I find. But later on in the episode, or it's a series episode, so later on in this series, as a set of Integrity Farms episodes, he partners with China because that's where all the money is. So he goes over to China and everybody's over there, and there's some conflicts about it. But within that episode, there's some negative uh, negative opinions about China. So China banned South Park completely after that episode.
They banned the whole show.
Yeah, the whole show, you can't access it anywhere in China.
Yeah, so that's a perfect example of why we need to deal with the situation in China. They have no respect for free speech. They have no respect for free trade. It's just a hellhole. And I'm sure if everyone from the West left China, it would be a literal hellhole, and they wouldn't be able to support the country.
Mhm. Yeah, if all the Western support, yeah. Like, yeah, I mean, it'd be important to support Hong Kong for reasons like that. I mean, that's a bastion of Western economic values.
Yeah, but we're so greedy. We need to sell our products to their 1.3 billion people. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the way it goes.
Mhm.
But I don't know. It's a tough situation. I think it is ultimately a moral question that we need to solve on an individual basis. And unfortunately, I think the trend in the West is more towards collectivism than individualism. So that's kind of the problem.
Well, I think that was a good conversation. I'll wrap it up in a little bit with my own uh, exit comments. So, yeah, thanks for talking.
Great. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. If you're thinking about boycotting China, it would be a good idea to be reflective on what way you want to respond to China. You don't want to consider only taking an active protest for the optics in front of your peers. You would want some meaningful change. If we care about our actions and acting ethically, we want to have something meaningful occur with their actions, not just wave our hands and hope that people like what we're doing or people might do the same thing. We can't simply think in idealized ways that we want everybody to act the same way. We can't expect everybody will boycott, and that's kind of what need for a boycott to work. People have to have the same expectations, the same desires. What you would want to think about instead is more about considering the values involved. You want to consider the value of products in some way connected with China, say Blizzard products. There is some connection with China. There is an interaction between Blizzard and China. And we have to consider the value of those games, but then we also have to consider the way that money is being exchanged and traded with China. It's not simply a matter of, oh, Blizzard is just one uniform entity and they trade with China, so if you don't like what they do, you don't trade. It's not so simple as that, because there's a whole variety of people involved, especially game designers that may have nothing to do with those economic or political decisions at Blizzard. If you care about products Blizzard makes, you want to distinguish between these things. If I care about a product like Diablo 4, which is coming out in maybe a year or two from Blizzard, and this game impacts my life for the better, then boycotting Blizzard would be harming myself, simply because I'm not getting the product that improves my life. But at the same time, I care about individual rights. So it also harms myself to do nothing. But the option isn't either boycott or do nothing. I can be creative about my values. I can become, say, a vocal person within the Blizzard community, whether even a community within World of Warcraft or Overwatch or other Blizzard products. The same could apply to the NBA. you can be vocal within that community without condemning basketball as a whole. If you had the desire, you could make your own league. There's nothing stopping you necessarily from doing your own thing instead. If other people believe in your ideals in the same way you believe in, you're hoping that they would believe in a boycott the same way as you, then hopefully they would join in with you. It's not like you're up against the world. You can ask people to join in with you. You could even, if you were a game design company, you could attract Blizzard designers to leave Blizzard and come to you instead because of the values you stand for. And you, as long as you stand for something better than the alternative, people will come to you. And that's what you want to seek out in your actions. If boycotting can do that, then that would be the right option. But you don't want to limit yourself simply based on what other people are saying. Boycotts are simple, but they don't necessarily work. Not that we only care about the consequences, but if we want to do something with our actions, something meaningful must happen. If nothing meaningful happens, it's hard to say your actions were good or bad. They were just lost. So really when it comes down to it, just consider the interests you want to express. Consider the interests of individual rights, but also the product that you care about.
Thank you for watching this episode of Welcome to Reality. Please join us next time for another discussion where we apply philosophical ideas to moral and political action. To support the show, please share our content and consider becoming a sponsor. You'll find a link to our Patreon page in the description of this video.